They say some places remember the people who belong to them, even when those people have forgotten themselves. The rain had been falling since dawn, a slow silver curtain drifting across the mountains of northern Vermont and turning the winding back roads into ribbons of mud and mist. Caleb Whitaker guided his aging pickup through the fog with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel while the other tapped an old army watch that had long since stopped keeping time. At 40 years old, Caleb had stopped expecting much from life. The war was years behind him, yet its echoes still lingered in the quiet spaces of his mind. He owned little more than the truck beneath him, a duffel bag in the back seat, and the loyal German shepherd riding beside him. Ranger sat upright, ears alert, amber eyes fixed on the world beyond the windshield as though listening to something hidden beneath the sound of the rain. The dog had been Caleb's companion for nearly 6 years, and over that time Caleb had learned to trust Ranger's instincts more than maps, road signs, or even his own judgment. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly across rolling hills wrapped in mist. Towering maples and ancient pines lined the narrow road, their branches swaying gently in the wind. It was the kind of landscape that seemed untouched by time, a place where old stories could still survive. Caleb wasn't searching for anything in particular. He had spent months drifting from town to town, taking temporary jobs when he could find them and moving on whenever the road called him elsewhere. Home had become a difficult word to define. Around midday, the rain softened into a faint drizzle. Ranger suddenly lifted his head higher. His ears locked forward. A low whine escaped his throat. Caleb glanced at him. "What is it, boy?" Ranger did not look away from the trees. Seconds later he barked once. Then again. Then a third time. 3 short barks. The signal was familiar. During their years together, Ranger only used it when something demanded attention. Caleb eased his foot off the gas. Ahead, beyond the roadside brush, a narrow opening appeared between 2 massive oak trees. He would have driven past it if not for Ranger. There was no sign. No visible trail. Just a gap in the forest partially hidden by vines and overgrown branches. Ranger barked again and placed one paw against the dashboard. Caleb sighed softly. "All right. Let's take a look." He turned onto the faint path, branches brushing the sides of the truck as they moved deeper into the woods. The air seemed different here. Quieter. Older somehow. After nearly half a mile, the trees began to thin. The mist opened like a curtain. Caleb slowed the truck and stared. Before them stretched a vast orchard hidden within the valley. Hundreds of apple trees stood in perfect rows beneath the gray sky. Their twisted branches shimmered with rain. Though clearly abandoned, the orchard felt strangely alive. A weathered iron gate leaned crookedly at the entrance. Vines wrapped around its rusted frame. Caleb stepped from the truck, boots sinking into wet earth. Ranger moved ahead cautiously. Then Caleb noticed the faded words engraved across the arch above the gate. His breath caught. Through decades of rust and moss, one name remained visible. Whitaker Orchard. For a long moment, neither man nor dog moved. Somewhere beyond the trees, a distant bell rang once, carried softly through the fog. And for reasons Caleb could not explain, it felt less like a welcome and more like a memory waiting to be remembered. The bell did not ring a second time. Its single note faded into the mist until only the soft patter of rain remained. Caleb stood motionless beneath the rusted archway, staring at the weather-worn letters above him. Whitaker Orchard. The name felt familiar in the way an old melody feels familiar even when the words have been forgotten. Ranger moved ahead through the gate, his paws silent against the wet grass. The German shepherd did not seem nervous. If anything, he appeared purposeful, as though he had reached a destination he somehow expected to find. Caleb followed slowly. The orchard stretched farther than he had first realized. Rows of apple trees disappeared into the gray haze, their branches heavy with leaves despite the season. Rainwater clung to every limb like tiny crystals. It was beautiful, yet strangely Untouched. No broken fencing. No fallen equipment. No signs of vandalism. It looked less abandoned than simply forgotten. As Caleb walked deeper among the trees, he noticed something unusual. Small wooden markers stood at the base of many trunks. Most were old and faded beyond recognition. Curious, he knelt beside one and brushed away moss with his glove. A name emerged beneath the dirt. Eleanor. He moved to the next marker. Samuel. Then another. Margaret. Each tree seemed dedicated to a person. The realization sent a faint chill through him. This was not merely an orchard. It felt more like a living memorial. Ranger suddenly paused several yards ahead. His ears twitched. Then he turned left between two rows of trees and continued walking. Caleb followed. The dog led him toward the center of the valley where the orchard opened into a circular clearing. There, standing alone beneath the mist, grew the largest apple tree Caleb had ever seen. Its trunk was nearly 12 feet across. Thick roots rose from the earth like ancient stone walls. Its canopy spread so wide it sheltered half the clearing beneath its branches. Something about the tree commanded silence. Ranger approached it slowly and sat down. Caleb stepped closer. The bark was deeply furrowed with age. Hundreds of carved initials covered its surface, some so old they had nearly vanished into the wood. As his eyes wandered across the trunk, one carving stopped him cold. C.W. The letters were small but unmistakable. He reached out and touched them. The grooves felt smooth beneath his fingertips. Not recent. Not fresh. Years old. Decades perhaps. Caleb frowned. His pulse quickened. He had never been here before. He was certain of that. Yet seeing those initials carved into the heart of the orchard felt oddly personal. Before he could think further, a sudden gust swept through the clearing. Leaves rustled overhead. Somewhere among the branches came a soft clicking sound. Caleb looked up. Hanging from one of the lower limbs was an object partially hidden by foliage. It swung gently in the breeze. He stepped closer. It was a small wooden wind chime, weathered by time but still intact. Suspended beneath it was a narrow brass plate. Caleb lifted it carefully. The metal felt cool in his hand. A few engraved words remained visible despite years of exposure. If you have returned, follow the creek. Caleb stared at the message. Ranger rose immediately and looked toward the northern edge of the clearing where a narrow stream disappeared into the trees. The dog's tail moved once. Not excited. Certain. The mist seemed thicker now, curling between the trunks like drifting smoke. Caleb glanced back toward the road they had entered from. For a brief moment, leaving seemed like the sensible choice. Yet something deep inside him resisted the thought. He slipped the brass plate into his jacket pocket and looked toward Ranger. The German shepherd was already waiting beside the creek. And somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the orchard, another piece of the mystery was waiting for them. The creek wound north through the orchard like a silver ribbon stitched into the valley long before any road had been built. Caleb followed its course beneath arching branches while Ranger moved several yards ahead, stopping occasionally to glance back as if making sure his partner kept pace. The air smelled of rain, apples, and damp earth. Somewhere overhead, unseen birds called through the fog. For the first time in years, Caleb felt something unfamiliar settling inside him. It was not peace exactly. It was responsibility. The brass plate in his jacket pocket felt heavier with every step. If someone had left a message waiting for him, then someone had expected him to arrive. That thought stayed with him as the creek curved toward a weathered wooden footbridge hidden among maples. On the far side stood a small white mailbox mounted on a cedar post. The sight surprised him. The structure looked maintained despite the orchard's isolation. Ranger crossed the bridge first and sat beside the mailbox. Caleb opened the rusted door. Inside rested a single envelope. His name was written across the front in neat blue ink. Caleb Whitaker. His pulse quickened. The paper looked recent. Not decades old. Recent. He opened it carefully. Inside was a typed letter. Mr. Whitaker, if you are reading this, then you have entered. Property currently under review by Evergreen Valley Holdings. Please contact our office immediately before disturbing any protected areas. A business card slipped from the envelope and landed in the grass. Caleb stared at it. The mystery he had expected was suddenly becoming something else entirely. This was not a forgotten orchard waiting quietly for its owner. Someone already knew about this place. Someone was watching it. Ranger rose and sniffed the air. Moments later the distant sound of an engine drifted through the valley. Caleb immediately folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. Old instincts returned. Years in uniform had taught him that information was valuable, especially when you did not yet understand the situation. He stepped off the trail and moved behind a cluster of trees. Ranger followed without needing a command. Through the branches, Caleb watched a dark green sport utility vehicle roll slowly along a service road on the opposite hillside. It did not stop. It simply drove past the orchard before disappearing into the mist. Yet the message was clear. This valley was not as abandoned as it seemed. The realization created a new pressure. Until now, every clue had pointed backward into family history. Now the threat pointed forward. If a company wanted the land badly enough to monitor it, then whatever lay hidden here mattered in the present, not just the past. Caleb looked toward the creek. Part of him wanted to leave. Life had taught him that complicated situations often carried painful endings. But another part remembered the carved initials, the names beneath the trees, and the strange feeling that the orchard had been waiting. He was tired of walking away from every place that asked something of him. Ranger suddenly nudged Caleb's hand. The dog was staring downstream. There, partially concealed beneath overhanging branches, stood an old stone structure Caleb had not noticed before. It resembled a pump house built beside the water decades ago. Its door hung slightly open. Above the entrance, someone had recently painted a small red symbol. Fresh paint. Fresh enough to shine through the mist. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Whatever waited. Inside that building had nothing to do with memories. It had everything to do with whoever was still coming here now. Caleb waited nearly a full minute before approaching the stone structure. The mist drifted across the creek in slow ribbons, wrapping the building in a veil that made it appear older than it probably was. Ranger remained alert beside him, his ears forward and his gaze fixed on the partially open door. Unlike before, the dog showed no signs of urgency. He was not warning Caleb away. He was watching. That difference mattered. Caleb moved carefully across the wet grass and stopped a few feet from the entrance. The fresh red symbol painted above the doorway looked familiar, though he could not immediately place it. Years of engineering work in the army had trained him to notice markings, boundaries, and signs left by people who wanted information conveyed without words. This symbol was deliberate. Someone expected others to recognize it. Inside, the structure was surprisingly clean. Sunlight filtered through narrow openings in the stone walls, illuminating a room no larger than a garden shed. There were no tools. No machinery. No evidence that anyone used it as a pump house. Instead, a large wooden table occupied the center of the room. On it sat dozens of rolled maps secured with twine. Caleb exchanged a glance with Ranger before stepping closer. The maps appeared modern. Some showed topographic surveys of the valley. Others displayed water tables, property boundaries, and geological notes. Several carried the logo of Evergreen Valley Holdings. Caleb studied them carefully. What he found unsettled him. The orchard itself was highlighted in nearly every document. Not because of its apple trees. Not because of its history. The land beneath it had been marked repeatedly with circles, measurements, and references to underground reservoirs. A note typed in bold letters appeared across one survey. Acquisition incomplete. Ownership unresolved. Caleb slowly exhaled. The orchard was not being protected. It was being pursued. The realization changed everything. Until now he had assumed the mystery revolved around his family. Suddenly the orchard felt less like an inheritance and more like the center of a quiet struggle nobody had explained. Ranger walked to the far corner of the room and sat beside an old metal cabinet. The dog nudged the door with his nose. Caleb opened it. Inside he found something entirely unexpected. A collection of photographs. Hundreds of them. Most showed the orchard through different seasons over many years. Yet as Caleb sorted through the stack, one image caught his attention immediately. It showed a young woman standing beside the massive tree at the center of the clearing. Her dark hair moved in the wind. Her smile was gentle and familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. Caleb stared at the photograph. He had seen that face before. Not in person. In a faded picture his mother had once kept in a box of old belongings. The woman was his grandmother. On the back of the photograph, written in blue ink, was a short message. If they ever come for the valley, the truth is beneath the bell. Caleb read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Ranger suddenly stood and turned toward the doorway. Outside, the distant sound of another engine echoed through the trees. This time it was closer. Much closer. Caleb slipped the photograph into his jacket and gathered several maps. The mystery surrounding his family had just collided with something far larger. And somewhere in the orchard, hidden beneath whatever the message called the bell, waited the answer both he and Evergreen Valley Holdings seemed desperate to find. By the time evening settled over the valley, the rain had faded into a fine silver mist that drifted between the trees like breath. Caleb sat beneath the shelter of the old stone structure, studying the photograph and the map spread across the table. Ranger rested nearby, his head on his paws, though his eyes remained open. The dog seemed calm, but not relaxed. He was waiting. Caleb understood the feeling. A few days earlier he would have accepted every clue at face value. Now he saw something different. Every document pointed in a different direction. Every answer seemed designed to create another question. Someone wanted him confused. Someone wanted him chasing shadows instead of finding the truth. He folded the photograph carefully and placed it inside a waterproof pouch. Then he copied key notes from the maps into a small notebook and returned the originals exactly where he had found them. If anyone came looking, they would never know he had been there. The decision felt strangely empowering. For the first time since entering the valley, he was not reacting. He was planning. Outside, twilight deepened. The orchard grew quiet except for the gentle murmur of the creek. Caleb stepped into the cool evening air and looked toward the distant silhouette of the giant tree at the center of the valley. Ranger rose immediately. Without hesitation, the German shepherd began walking toward it. Caleb followed. They reached the clearing just as the last light faded from the western sky. The enormous tree stood motionless against the darkening horizon. Its branches stretched outward like protective arms. Ranger circled the trunk once. Then twice. Then he stopped beside one of the massive roots and stared at the ground. Caleb knelt beside him. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed a narrow line running through the soil. It was too straight to be natural. Carefully brushing away leaves and dirt, he uncovered the edge of a metal plate hidden beneath the root system. His pulse quickened. Before he could examine it further, headlights suddenly appeared through the trees. Caleb immediately stepped back into the shadows. A black vehicle rolled into the clearing and stopped near the edge of the orchard. The engine shut off. A man stepped out carrying a lantern. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, dressed in a heavy brown coat. What surprised Caleb was not the man's presence. It was his expression. The stranger did not look like someone searching for treasure. He looked like someone carrying a burden. The man approached the giant tree slowly and placed a hand against its bark. Then he spoke softly into the darkness. "I hoped you would never come back." Caleb froze. The words were not directed at him. They were directed at the tree itself. Moments later the stranger removed an envelope from his coat pocket and tucked it into a hollow in the trunk. He stood there for several seconds before quietly returning to his vehicle and driving away. Only after the headlights disappeared did Caleb emerge. Ranger was already standing beside the hollow. Caleb retrieved the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single handwritten letter. The first sentence stopped his breath. "To the son we were forced to hide, if you are reading this, the people who raised you were never meant to find you." Beneath the words was a signature Caleb had never seen before. Not Whitaker. Not any name he recognized. And suddenly the mystery was no longer about who owned the orchard. It was about why someone had spent 40 years making sure Caleb would never discover who he truly was. The night wind swept through the valley, rustling the apple leaves like the whispers of a distant past that had never been named. Caleb stood frozen, his fingers tightly gripping the yellowed parchment paper. The world he had always known, the world of a lonely, 40-year-old veteran, of aimless drives and smoldering wartime echoes, had suddenly shattered with a single sentence. He was not a Whitaker. The name he had carried for so long, the pride, and even the family pain, turned out to be nothing more than a velvet curtain drawn to conceal a much deeper secret. A low growl brought Caleb back to reality. Ranger was already standing by his side, his amber eyes reflecting the dim light of the night, steadfast and unwavering. The dog did not care what last name he bore. To Ranger, he was simply his partner, the commander he trusted implicitly. Caleb knelt down, burying his hand in the thick fur of his four-legged friend, feeling his warmth and steady breathing. The turmoil in his chest suddenly quieted, replaced by the cold, sharp resolve of a soldier. He looked back at the metal plate hidden beneath the roots of the ancient tree and the envelope in his hand. Evergreen Valley Holdings might want to seize this valley for its underground reservoir, but to Caleb, this valley had now become the sanctuary of truth. If someone had spent 40 years erasing his footprints, he would spend the rest of his life digging them back up. Caleb carefully folded the letter into his jacket pocket, right next to the maps and the photograph of the woman with the familiar smile. He turned his head toward the exit of the orchard, where the mist was parting to reveal the trail leading back to his old pickup truck. Tonight, the rain had stopped. Caleb Whitaker, or whoever he was meant to be, walked forward no longer as a fugitive or a directionless drifter.